Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Bradley Thayer, founding member of the Committee on the Present-Endangered China. He sheds light on the book he co-authored titled Understanding the China Threat, how that understanding can help us determine what our next step should be in countering the Chinese regime and more. Let's dive in. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So coming up in the news is China's 20th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is expected to secure a third term. So if that happens, going ahead, what should the U.S.'s priorities be in dealing with the Chinese regime?
Well, U.S. priorities should first be to prepare for a far more aggressive and assertive China than what we have encountered thus far. China's growth has been alarming, and that has fueled an aspect of aggression in its foreign policies. After the 20th Party Congress, we should expect this to become worse. And we should expect it to be so because Xi Jinping will have his domestic house in order if events develop on October 16th and afterward as anticipated. As you stated, he receives a third term. I think that's quite likely. But what that means is that Xi Jinping will now have established his control over the party, and that dissidents or elements which are opposed to him are really neutered or under his control. He's ensured that he's dominant, and thus the party's control over China is as well. So since he does have his domestic situation in place, we should expect that he now has the opportunity to convert his power and attention in international politics against his neighbors in the South China Sea, against U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific and globally. So we should expect a far more active and belligerent Xi Jinping after the 20th Party Congress.
And Bradley, it thinks like a lot of this comes down to understanding what the Chinese regime is and who Xi Jinping is. So on that note, you actually recently co-wrote a book coming out called Understanding the China Threat. So tell us about that book.
Certainly. The book addresses two major issues. First would be to understand why China is a threat to the United States. And it is a threat because of its ideology. The Chinese Communist Party's ideology has been focused on the United States since before the Chinese regime came to power in 1949, and it has since been focused on the United States in an effort to destroy U.S. interests and the ability of the United States to check the Chinese Communist Party. So in the work, we go through in significant detail the genesis of the Chinese Communist Party, its evolution, and the party under Xi Jinping today. The second major component is that we look at what the U.S. should do about it. So given that the Chinese regime is under the control of this odious ideology and individual, Xi Jinping, what should the United States do to check it? And we suggest different steps that the U.S. should take, including having a more robust deterrent posture in the Indo-Pacific, focusing on China's human rights abuses against its own citizens as well as internationally, and also looking at tearing down the Great Firewall so that Chinese citizens can access the internet without any encumbrance from the Chinese regime. That is, using technologies or in cooperation with the United States, the British, and other actors, technologies may be employed that would allow free and fair access for Chinese citizens that would allow them to access the internet freely. And as a result of that, accelerate the demise of the Chinese regime. Fundamentally in the book, we argue that the Chinese regime is not legitimate. It's never been voted into office. Its activities against the Chinese people have been atrocious, of course, in its long history. And if it stays in power, it's going to be an ever greater belligerent and aggressive force with enormous complications and implications for international stability and the likelihood of conflict in international politics.
Bradley, on the note of the Chinese Party, Communist Party staying in power, what does that mean for A, the Chinese people, and B, the international world order?
What it means for the Chinese people is that they are fettered by this regime, which abuses their human rights and restricts the ability of the Chinese to have their human rights exercised fully, to have access to information, to have political rights, civil rights, as we know them in the West. And so the Chinese people have to live under this dead hand of the Chinese regime. So the day couldn't come soon enough when, of course, China is freed from that, and the Chinese people live as the Taiwanese do, right? We have an example in Taiwan of what the Chinese people could enjoy, how they could live if they were freed from that odious ideology. What it means for international politics is that this is a group of gangsters, the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, and it means belligerence. It means aggression in the East China Sea against the Japanese and against Taiwan, in the South China Sea against the Philippines, Vietnam, and other states on the periphery of the South China Sea, against India, Myanmar, as well in South Asia. Control of Africa, where the Chinese regime's presence is defined by exploitation of people and the environment wherever the Chinese regime shows up. In South America and Central America as well. So we see a belligerence in terms of its ideological aggression, in terms of its military buildup, in its nuclear capabilities and conventional capabilities, and that translates into aggression directly against its neighbors, but also against the liberal international order. The rules and norms that have governed international politics since 1945, when the British and the Americans created them. If China were, heaven forbid, to rule the world, of course, everyone who had a vested interest in that liberal international order for free trade, for free finance, exchange of goods, for political rights and human rights, would find that the Chinese regime has a very different attitude towards that, and their relationship would be defined by, again, exploitation and serving the interests of the Chinese regime. So it's a future that we argue should never obtain, and there's much that the U.S. and its allies and the Chinese people themselves can do to prevent that outcome.
And Bradley, on the ideological front, why is the Chinese regime, aiming so hard to stamp out the West, especially America?
Because it knows it's illegitimate, and it wants to destroy alternatives to it. It knows that the West has provided a better lifestyle, a better political organization, economic organization, social organization. The West went through women's rights movements. It went through civil rights movements, right, to ensure that women can participate freely and that racial minorities or sexual minorities in the West would have the freedoms as well. China will never go through that under the Chinese regime. And so the Chinese regime recognizes that it's illegitimate, and alternatives, the better future promised by the West, is a direct threat to that legitimacy. And as long as the West is around and individuals encounter it around the world, the Chinese people see it, the regime is insecure. It knows the vulnerability due to its illegitimacy can be exploited. So it's fearful of the West, and it seeks to destroy it. At the same time, it also is incoherent, because Chinese communism is a Western product. It was a product of Marxism through Lenin, and then through the Communist International into China, with Mao's imprint on it. That is not a traditional Han polity. It's not the traditional Chinese political organization. So it's very curious. It would be as if Confucianism were the dominant ideology in the West. right? We would say Confucianism is not the way to organize our politics. It's not the ideology that we should follow, and it's at variance with Western political culture and civilization. Well, that's where the Chinese communists are, right? They have this Western ideology, which is at complete variance with Han history, with the history of China and political organization within China. So because of their illegitimacy, because of their abuses, and because of fundamentally of their lack of popularity within among the Chinese people themselves, they seek to destroy alternatives. Now that they have the power to do so, right now that they've been growing in power decade after decade, we're at a particularly dangerous time. And the 20th Party Congress is really that pivot point where we can say that the history of the Chinese Communist Party was one way before the 20th Party Congress, and it's going to be another way after the 20th Party Congress. So it's an alarming time.
And given that, Bradley, what can freedom-loving countries and individuals do then?
Well, there's much to be done. First, to recognize that victory is possible, that the Chinese regime should be confronted. And if it's confronted, it can be defeated. And it can be defeated through ideology, or not through a kinetic means. We don't want it to come to conflict, obviously, kinetic conflict. But in the ideological conflict, which is something that the West should wage aggressively against the Chinese regime, to convey to the world and the Chinese people that the regime is not legitimate and the Chinese people don't have to suffer under it. There are so many other steps beyond recognizing that victory is possible against the regime because it's illegitimate. There are many practical measures that can be taken to ensure that the regime is undermined. One would be to support the Chinese people and to support human rights within China, religious freedoms of Falun Gong and of the Muslim minority, of the Tibetan people, and others in China, to ensure that political and human rights for all Chinese people are respected, to support a free internet availability and accessibility to the Chinese people, to ensure that Chinese technological domination does not come to pass by monitoring what equipment you're buying, what apps you're putting on your phone, what type of technology we're weaving into our networks, fighting extraterritoriality that the Chinese people have, essentially the police forces which have received elements of some attention, where the Chinese regime have used essentially their police forces in New York and other cities, is something that absolutely has to be stopped as part of Operation Fox Hunt, or really the effort of the Chinese regime to suppress dissidents and Chinese individuals living in the United States. That has to be stopped. Those dissidents have to be supported and their stories told so that the truth can come out about the oppressive nature of the Chinese regime. So there's much that can be done on an individual basis, and there's much that the West, the United States, countries around the world, and the Chinese people themselves can do. A united front is absolutely necessary to defeat the Chinese regime, and that's something that can coalesce. Finally, don't believe their lies, right? A free media is absolutely important, and to be aware of efforts of Chinese propaganda and efforts to spread that propaganda through media, their own outlets and other media, to ensure that you understand the true nature of the regime and you're not fooled by their efforts to cloak it into a common destiny of mankind or an image of China which touts scientific progress or which touts space exploration or the purported happiness of the Chinese people while masking the true nature of the regime, which is a totalitarian dictatorship. So those are all measures that could be done by individuals, as well as, of course, supporting governments to take those measures to fight the Chinese regime.
That was Bradley Thayer, founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China and co-author of Understanding the China Threat. For those watching our full episode, after a break, we hear more from him on what steps can be taken when the economies of the two superpowers are intertwined and what we can expect in regards to Taiwan. Our full episode is available on Epoch TV. To sign up, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.